The Black Death, when horror slathered Europe. It began quietly, a whisper in the east, a merchant coughing blood on a trade ship, a shadow spreading faster than the wind. By the time Europe noticed, death was already at its doorstep. In the autumn of 1347, 12 ships drifted into the Sicilian port of Messina. Locals rushed to greet them, expecting spices, silk, and stories from the east. Instead, they found horror. Men lay lifeless on the decks, their bodies covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus. The few still breathing coughed violently, their skin blotched and purple. The air itself reeked of decay. The city panicked. The ships were ordered back to sea, but it was already too late. The plague had arrived in Europe. Within weeks, entire households were gone. Streets turned silent, except for the distant toll of church bells and the wailing of the dying. Rats scurried through empty marketplaces, their fleas carrying an invisible killer, Yersinia pestis. No one knew its name. They just called it the pestilence. Priests said it was God's punishment. Scholars blamed foul air from the east. Astrologers pointed to the alignment of planets. But none of their explanations mattered, because the death didn't stop. Villages vanished overnight. Cities sealed their gates. Families abandoned their loved ones. In Florence, chroniclers wrote that brother abandoned brother, wife abandoned husband, and even mothers fled from their own children. The disease struck with terrifying speed. A healthy man could eat breakfast, fall feverish by noon, and be dead before nightfall. Dark swellings appeared under the arms and between the thighs. Buboes, they called them, followed by vomiting, fever, and the stench of rotting flesh. Those who survived the first days were rare, almost miraculous. Soon, the dead outnumbered the living. Gravediggers collapsed beside open pits. Bells tolled endlessly until there was no one left to ring them. In London, carts rolled through the streets as a single cry echoed, "Bring out your dead." But the horror wasn't just in the numbers, it was in the silence that followed. Fields lay untended, animals wandered masterless, and the wind carried a smell no one could escape, the scent of death itself. Across Europe, whispers turned into prayers, and prayers into madness. People whipped themselves through the streets, begging for forgiveness. Some turned to witchcraft, others to violence. Entire communities of outsiders, Jews, beggars, travelers, were hunted and burned, accused of poisoning wells or angering God. The world seemed to be ending, and yet, amid this chaos, the plague traveled on, unseen, unstoppable, crossing borders and oceans, with a purpose no one could understand. As it spread, something strange happened. Reports began to surface of places where death behaved differently, towns where the disease seemed to spare certain people, or where strange lights flickered in the night sky before the first deaths began. Was it coincidence, or something darker? The chronicles are filled with stories. Monks who heard whispers from empty cloisters, grave diggers who swore they saw shadows moving beneath the earth, and survivors who claimed they were touched by death, but not taken. The Black Death was more than a disease. It was a transformation of Europe's very soul. It stripped away the illusion of safety and revealed what lay beneath: fear, faith, and the fragile thread of civilization. But this was only the beginning, because as Europe descended into despair, the plague began to change, becoming something that defied explanation. By 1348, the plague had devoured Italy, France, and England. But what terrified people most was not the dying. It was the change that came after. Cities that once echoed with laughter now whispered with ghosts. Streets, once filled with merchants and children, became corridors of wind and ash. Churches overflowed, not with worshippers, but with corpses. The world itself felt cursed. In Paris, Physicians bled patients with leeches and burned herbs in the streets to clean the air. In Venice, the first quarantine stations were built, a desperate attempt to keep the sick from the living. But even isolation could not stop the invisible tide. People began to believe that the plague had a mind of its own. There were reports of strange omens, comets streaking across black skies, rivers running red with clay and blood, and spectral figures wandering near graveyards. Chroniclers wrote of a dark wind that preceded outbreaks, carrying the scent of death from town to town. Some even claimed to hear it, a faint whisper before the first cough, a sound like breathing through broken glass. Superstition became survival. In Germany, flagellants roamed from city to city, whipping themselves bloody in the streets to atone for humanity's sins. In some villages, people locked themselves in their homes and painted crosses on the doors, red for hope, black for surrender. But nothing worked. By winter, the plague had reached the northern kingdoms, England, Norway, Denmark. Whole fleets of ships drifted ashore with skeleton crews, the last survivors frozen to their decks. And then came the second horror. The dead refused to stay buried. Graveyards overflowed, forcing people to dig shallow pits or throw bodies into rivers. Dogs and crows feasted on flesh. In some places, it was said that the ground itself moved, swelling and heaving, as if something beneath it was still alive. Villagers whispered of walking corpses, figures seen at dusk near burial mounds or scratching against the church walls. Priests called them revenants, spirits of the unrepentant dead, returned to drag the living into the grave. One chronicler in Eastern Europe described an entire village that vanished after a burial gone wrong. The priest who conducted the funeral wrote that the sky turned black at noon, and a hand, pale, rotting, and human, reached out from the earth before they fled. No one ever returned, but even amid terror, life struggled to continue. Merchants still traded, kings still plotted wars, and survivors rebuilt what they could. Yet the eyes of those who lived through it were forever changed, hollow, haunted, never trusting the world again. Something had shifted in humanity's spirit. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it murdered belief. Before the pestilence, people saw the world as God's perfect creation, orderly, blessed, unshakable. After it, they saw chaos, fragility, a dark, uncontrollable force that could erase everything in a breath. In the words of one monk from Avignon, God's face turned away from us, and what stared back was something else. That something else would linger for centuries. In the art, the nightmares, the architecture of fear that shaped the Renaissance to come. But the final stage of the Black Death was the most chilling of all, because as the plague's fury faded, it left behind something unseen, traces of the horror that no prayer could wash away. Whispers of survivors who could still hear the bells tolling at night. Children born during the pestilence who grew up dreaming of shadows that whispered their names, and stories of a second darkness waiting beneath Europe's soil. The kind that doesn't die, the kind that remembers. It finally loosened its grip. Recognizable. Fields, cities half, and silence hung heavier than smoke. Survivors walked through ghost towns, brushed them and moved on, but prints everywhere. In art, beside piles of corpses. In sermons, priests in decay. Even laughter, hollow, nervous, as if mocking the dead. Something inside had cracked. The plague changed not just the world, but the soul itself. Filled with black hooded figures and whispers of unseen watchers. It seemed darker, the stars colder. Terror, Europe was reborn. More curious, but never. Science rose from superstition, and yet every discovery, the same question lingered. Had they truly defeated death, or merely survived its first warning? Even today, centuries later, bones unearthed from plague pits tell stories that still chill the blood. Stories of a time when horror wore no mask, only the face of humanity itself. Which dark chapter of history should I uncover next?